Okay, everybody, I think we'll make a start because we've got quite a lot to get through today. I don't want anyone to see my face. So today, well, did everyone have a nice reading week? You probably didn't have such a great reading week, actually, with that deadline on the Friday, but hopefully you all had a nice, relaxing weekend anyway. So we're going to do content analysis today, of course. A lot of people use this method in their dissertations, so hence the reason why I've kind of done it first. Content analysis is a very kind of common method in media and communications research, and it's becoming increasingly common. So I kind of just pulled out this stat here from a Riff and Freitag paper. And they found that in 1971, only about 6% of papers used content analysis. This was in Journalism and Mass Communications Quarterly. Whereas, by 1995, like over a third of papers use content analysis. And I think it's actually higher than that now, so it's kind of tailed off a little bit, the increase, but it's still increasing. So you can see that it's a really kind of common method. And this is largely due, well, in part, to the fact that it is very flexible. Kind of as we go through it, I think you'll see that it is very flexible. You can apply it to lots of different content, lots of different texts, lots of different meanings, lots of different topics. So it is a very kind of flexible method. And I think actually definitely more than half of the dissertations that I've ever supervised have been based on content analysis. So it is a kind of really common and flexible method. So what is content analysis? I'm sure most of you, a lot of you will already know this because I've had a little peep at the reviews, and a lot of you did critical reviews based on papers that use content analysis, so you probably already kind of have a good idea. But it is, content analysis is a systematic, replicable technique for compressing many words of text into fewer content categories based on explicit rules of coding. This can often be literally compressing, millions and millions of words, newspapers, books, diaries, diaries of kind of whole societies and kind of things like this. And kind of, drawing out, so it's not thematic analysis, although it can be, but it's kind of drawing out, common elements, different kind of themes, symbols, meanings from that text in a way that, we can actually make sense of. Because when you've got all these kind of, original content analysis was just looking through diaries and books, and how do you actually make sense of this, right? And then it allows inferences to be drawn. And this can, obviously be kind of corroborated with other methods. So you can do a content analysis of kind of newsrooms, and then follow this up with interviews, for instance. Maybe case 6 says, you can sift through large volumes of data with relative ease in a systematic fashion. And it is, again, the reason why I think researchers like it kind of boils down to this Krippendorf quote here. It's a technique that allows us to infer from symbolic data that which would be either too costly, no longer possible, or too obtrusive to use by other techniques. So, if you do think about kind of doing diary research, archival research, it can be of societies that don't exist or people who have died. I do campaign research. I could go out and interview the 3,000 people who ran for Parliament in 2017, but I don't really want to do that because it would take literally the rest of my life. So I can kind of, look at their campaign materials online, or offline, leaflets, etc. It would be very costly as well. So it is a kind of good technique in this sense. This is kind of just boiling down those quotes, but it's a family of procedures for systematic, replicable analysis of texts, and it involves the classification of parts of text through the application of a structured, systematic coding scheme. So the coding scheme is really, really important in content analysis. I'll kind of go through how to come up with a really kind of good coding scheme this morning. because that really is the crux of this method, right? If you've got a really good coding scheme, you know, I got lots of citations from the coding scheme that I came up with in my PhD. I'm not saying you're going to go and do that, but people, you know, it is, in some sense, it's about being able to take that coding scheme and other people could take it and apply it to lots of different kind of data, and they would kind of come up with similar results. You know, you can replicate the sort of study. Yeah, so there's many uses of content analysis. So detect cultural patterns of groups, institutions, you know, people literally do content analyses of how laws pass through sort of different parliaments and kind of things like that. Individuals, so again, you know, properties of, you know, speeches, kind of things like that. Identifying the intentions of communication, so this is kind of something that is, you know, a really common method of content analysis. It's kind of been used to identify, you know, bias, propaganda, these kind of things. Trends, themes, yeah, code open-ended survey questions. So again, you know, if you have a survey and you have the kind of writing box at the end instead of the tick box, people kind of do content analysis on the sort of open-ended questions. Compare different levels of media, types of media. So for instance, you know, comparing tabloids with broadsheet newspapers, the different kind of things that appear in them, things like that. Well, there's millions. I mean, this is kind of just, you know, a kind of few here. And it's the same with text, you know, what counts as a text, basically anything can count as a text. So you can content analyse films, you can content analyse tweets, you know, it did used to be when, the reason I think why text is kind of used, I mean, it is used in comms and media anyway, is because originally content analysis was on texts, things that you sort of recognise as a text, so like diaries and letters. But you can apply it to, you know, anything, and it has been applied to anything, you know, medical records, speeches, that's a really common one in political communication, satirical sketches, drawings, conversations, you know, anything, basically. Manifestos of political parties is another kind of good one. So yeah, basically anything that counts as a text in communication and media, you can do content analysis on it. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of an old source, obviously, but Krippendorff is kind of, you know, he did a lot of this sort of seminal work on content analysis. And I think these 6 questions are still like kind of really good to sort of ground yourself when you start off doing a content analysis, and they're still really applicable. So even though it's quite an old source, I kind of use these really. And I still ask myself these questions when I start doing a content analysis. So, you know, firstly, you know, you should kind of know this, I guess, when you sort of start doing your content analysis, but, you know, what data are to be analysed, okay? So is it books, letters, newspapers, the actual source data, but beyond that, you know, which books, which letters, which newspapers, so based on what? So are you just going to do broadsheets? Or are you going to kind of do tabloids and broadsheets? Or are you just going to do left-wing papers? Or are you just going to do right-wing papers? You know, these kind of things. And that will be based on, you know, your research questions and kind of what you want to find out. You know, you can fall into pitfalls here, so kind of with the second question. So how are the data defined? Again, you know, especially with digital, so I think, you know, if you're kind of planning on doing something digital, this is sort of where this goes a little bit awry. So, you know, if you think about a newspaper, you know, you can have sort of natural boundaries of a newspaper, you can pick a newspaper up, but, you know, you might not want to content analyse every single line of that newspaper. If you're doing a political analysis, do you really want to content analyse the sport? So is it just the, you know, the front page? Is it just the headline? People do really good content analyses on headlines. And then kind of online news can get a little bit sticky or a little bit tricky. So Emily and I tried to essentially replicate a offline content analysis, use their actual coding scheme for online news, and we realised that that wasn't really possible because, you know, with algorithms on news sites and all the rest of it, often, you know, popular articles from days or even months or even years ago can kind of show up on the front page. We were doing the front page of news websites. And what does that really mean if we're trying to capture what the kind of stories that day are, and we've got articles from, years ago popping up on the front page? You have to kind of tweak these things. Yeah, so what is the population that you draw the data from? So again, if you're just going to look at 5 newspapers, the population is every newspaper and every news source that is printed in the UK, from like kind of the Morning Star to, like the Telegraph. Or, with the study that I'm kind of going to do the case study on in a moment, this was candidates standing in the general election, but, there's hundreds, there's like 10,000, I think, candidates. You don't always want to kind of be that exhaustive about it. So I just did the kind of candidates who are running for the top 5 parties. You do have to kind of cut these things off. So the population is there, you could do everything if you really wanted, but how useful is it? You've got to think about your kind of sampling for the data itself and, how you kind of draw that from the wider population. Yeah, and what is the context? So this will often be, you'll know the context, and this is what will be kind of in your introduction probably. So what is the kind of, question or problem or phenomenon that we're kind of interested in looking at, and, how will this aid us in kind of answering that question? So again, with the case study that I'm going to do, this was like campaign change and whether, social media kind of feeds into that. Parameters of the analysis are the measures, so any measures that you have. So, again, if we're looking at kind of abuse online, is there a swear word in the tweet? Is there an abusive term in the tweet? And what counts as an abusive term? What counts as a swear word? And where's the cut-off? And you have to be clear about that cut-off and these kind of things. So this is the parameters and the measures. And then what is the target of inference? So what are you trying to say something about by analysing this data more broadly? And kind of, if you go through those 6 questions, you'll end up with a good kind of, good data and good measures, but you'll probably kind of help to refine your research questions in terms of kind of thinking of the broader sort of questions as well. So yeah, I think they're kind of really good questions to start with, and probably you can apply these to other other methods as well. But they have been developed for content analysis. Yeah, so Weber says there's no right way to do content analysis, and that is true. You have to sort of refine your coding scheme, your frame, to what you're doing, and that is, again, a good advantage of this method. Well, there are kind of 2 sort of key types of data that you might want to look at when we're doing content analysis. And you can kind of look at one or the other, or you can combine them. I tend to combine them, and most studies do. So the first one is kind of the manifest content. So this is, as it sounds, the explicit or stated content. So the very obvious things that, almost everyone would agree is there in the text. So it lends itself to quantitative coding, and it can be very, very reliable. So again, like I was saying with tweets, is there a swear word in it? You can literally have just a list of swear words and kind of, from whatever down up, and just count whether that word is there. And it tends to be things that you can measure as a binary as well. So it's either there or it's not, 0, 1, yes, no. Just whether it's present or not. And this has, a high degree of replicability. So if I'll talk about intercode reliability in a moment, but manifest content does have a very high degree of reliability, or at least it should do. But, the kind of limitation with this is it tends to just be largely descriptive, right? You're not particularly deriving meaning, well, you can derive meaning certainly from manifest content, but, it can be surface level. It can be a little bit descriptive. And so sometimes we kind of want to push a little bit deeper than this. And these can be, this is how you set up the analysis and the results with these manifest kind of measures, but sometimes we want to just dig a little bit deeper into this. So that's where we come on to latent content. So this can be, you know, implicit content, unstated underlying meanings, themes, and what those themes kind of mean when they're present. But yes, so this is kind of the trade-off, right? So this latent content, kind of the underlying meaning, can be where the sort of unreliability creeps in. So this is again where we have to be very careful with how we kind of design our measures. So yeah, they're more qualitative. You can categorize meanings of passages. You know, you might want scores. So again, I'm kind of thinking just of the study that I just did again with the tweets and the swear words. So we had, do they swear? And then it was kind of a category for, is it kind of gendered swearing? You know, is there a racial element to it? Is it, you know, a kind of sexualized term? You know, kind of things like this sort of categories. And you can sort of derive more meaning from that. So yeah, fair enough, all MPs get sworn at, but is the more kind of sexualized swearing, is the more kind of, you know, strong swear words, are they kind of distributed differently, and are they kind of aimed at MPs differently? And it can be less reliable, checks are important, but it can tell you a lot more. So the kind of classic example that I always use is a study that Peter Goddard, you probably all know Peter. So he was involved in a study on the Iraq War, and they did a kind of comparison of, you know, headlines that explicitly said, basically, we should go to war in Iraq. We definitely should, you know. 9/11 happened, we should go to war in Iraq. That wasn't that common, you know, this editorialising explicitly, manifestly in kind of headlines or in articles, but, you know, looking, kind of reading between the lines, and don't read between the lines when you do latent content analysis, but I mean, that's a colloquialism. There was a lot more support for it if we kind of did this sort of latent content analysis. So kind of, you know, using words, you know, terrorism, not really talking about citizens in those countries, you know, innocent, you know, civilians and kind of things like this. You know, just analysing the language used, or the language not used even, right? Because if it's not there, that can almost be as symbolic as if it is there. And found that, you know, there was a lot of this kind of, you know, they were all being quite shy. They didn't want to say, you know, explicitly, yes, we should go to war. Well, everything that was published at that time was essentially saying, yes, we should. And we couldn't have really known that. It would have looked like there wasn't a lot of support if we just counted the manifest content. But if you kind of, you know, apply these more latent measures, you can get a lot more kind of meaning from it. Yeah, so this is kind of what you have to do when you actually start doing your content analysis, after you've kind of applied your 6 questions and kind of thought it through and decided what you kind of want to do. So yeah, you should kind of prepare the data. So this can be quite difficult. So again, you know, if you're looking at newspapers, are you going to look at all of them? Or are you just going to look at the front pages? And then it's probably a good idea to, you know, something like print your front pages off on a kind of A4 or A3 sheet and kind of have them in a nice pile that's easy to manage. I put tweets into a spreadsheet, so I'm not kind of scrolling, and that, you know, my kind of codes are right next to the tweets. It's much easier to do. You know, people can get their letters into, you know, I'm not saying go and learn like kind of these tools like MVevo, but this can be kind of helpful, but you can kind of do the low-tech version of it. So yeah, just transforming it into a manageable structure. So you'll see I've got kind of, when we do the workshop later, I've got emails, but I've kind of printed them just onto one side of A4, so they're a lot easier to sort of work with. Yeah, then you want to define your unit of analysis. So this is probably going to be quite well aligned with your data, right? So, you know, again, you know, if we're thinking about kind of elections, the unit of analysis in my case is the individual candidates, right? And I look at all of their kind of campaign materials. Well, you could kind of look at it at different units of analysis. So you could just look at parties, you know, and everything that they do rather than the actual individual candidates. Or you could just look at tweets on a certain hashtag, so that's a different unit of analysis. Words might be a unit of analysis, so it could just be every single word in your corpus, kind of things like that. So you just have to sort of decide on that for yourself, what is the best level for you to kind of focus on. Then you want to develop your categories. So yeah, it's in line with what you're trying to test, you know. But I think advice from me would be to be quite wide-ranging in the first instance, right? So there's always going to be something that you didn't think of, that you might think of later. I'll kind of go through this in a moment. So just kind of be as broad as you can with the categories in the first instance, because if you don't end up using them, it really doesn't take that much time to code them actually at the time. But you know, you don't want to kind of overlook something. I've done that so many times when I'm like, I should have just coded that as I was going along. So yeah, but think about what you're trying to test. You know, it's good to be broad at the start, but also, you know, you don't want to be coding things that are just totally nothing to do with anything that you're testing either. You know, it's kind of a bit of a trade-off. Yeah, and then test your coding scheme on a sample of text. This is really, really important. So do it on kind of, you know, 5%, 10% to begin with, because literally every single time I've ever done a content analysis, there's stuff that I haven't seen, you know, even when I've done a really extensive pilot and I start coding the full sample, I've not seen something, I realise that there's a variable that needs refining because there was kind of something, a different sort of category that I didn't kind of pick up on the first time. And then you just kind of need to sort of go round and round with that a little bit. So I kind of refine my coding schemes a few times. Then code your data, then you want to do a little bit of intercoder reliability, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then you do the analysis. So it kind of looks like this. So you get your sort of research questions and your objects, i.e. your data. You can develop categories based on theory, that's probably quite a good idea. Your main categories, your subcategories, so you know your variables, so is the headline supportive of a rack, and then you might want categories within that, so very supportive, somewhat supportive, you know, kind of things like this. I'll take you through an actual coding scheme in a moment. And then, you know, you kind of do your revision of your categories, and you can see here the arrow going round. This is where you sort of keep refining them until you're sure that it works. You know, it's got this kind of internal validity. And then you do your final working through your text and then your analysis. So this is good practice, kind of, you know, pilot, and then kind of refine it, you know, kind of do your formative checks, and then keep going around until you're kind of sure it works. Yeah. Yes, so, you know, it does extend beyond simple word counts, as we've kind of said, you know, there is this latent content. But essentially, you know, a category will be a group of words with similar meaning or connotations. So yeah, and it really, really, really importantly, you know, categories should be mutually exclusive, right? You shouldn't have categories where it's ambiguous which category that type of text falls into, or the symbol, or the meaning falls into. So like, it could be in that variable, or it could be in that one. You know, they want to be mutually exclusive. And really, you want as much space between the categories as possible. So you don't, you know, sometimes it's completely unavoidable. We want as little kind of fuzziness between the categories and as little grey area. You know, that's how you're going to get your reliability and your replicability. You know, it's really obvious which category this you know, meaning from the text falls into. And they should be exhaustive in that you should be able to code everything from the data. So even if that just means having an other category, you know, of kind of things that just crop up and they don't really mean anything, but perhaps you just want to kind of maybe take them out of the equation. So yeah, no unit falls between two data points, and each unit is represented by only one data point. This is a very sort of more statistical way of saying it. Well, yeah, you know, and again, you know, a very academic way of saying it, you know, internally homogeneous and externally heterogeneous. That's just a fancy way of saying, you know, the category means what it means quite clearly, and there's kind of no grey area here. There's quite a lot of space between the categories. Okay, so well, I'll kind of take you through an example of sort of like a code book and then how you sort of apply that. So this is what you would actually kind of do in practice when you're coming up with your codes and when you're coming up with your categories. So this is a content analysis comparing gender roles in magazine advertising. You know, there's tons of studies about this kind of thing. So obviously, you know, because we are looking at gender roles, you kind of want to measure the gender of the central figure in the advert, and this can be, you know, sometimes a little bit difficult to judge. So again, you might kind of want, I don't know, if I was doing this, I think I'd want kind of just another category for kind of secondary figures maybe as well. Because how do you always judge the central figure of an advert? It's a little bit hard, but anyway, that's what they did. So yeah, you know, you want kind of male and female there. You want the age, because obviously I think, you know, you can draw some inferences about kind of representation of sort of older women in the media. But if you kind of look there, you know, there's no overlap between the categories, right? So if you have, you know, not that anyone in this room would do this, but this is just a very obvious example of when, you know, there can be overlap. So you wouldn't have 18 to 34 and then, you know, 33 to 50 and then like 45 to 60, if you kind of get me. This is all kind of, you know, very obvious. Well, I don't know how you actually judge the age of people again in adverts, but, you know, this is where perhaps the sort of unreliability can creep in. But the actual coding scheme is very clear, you know, there's no overlap there. And then there's kind of jobs, roles, yeah, credibility again. Some kind of, yeah, lots of subjectivity coming in here. But the actual coding scheme is pretty sound. And then this is how you actually, so, you know, then you get your advert in front of you, if it's a magazine advert, and you literally just look at it and apply these codes to that advert, right? So is it a man or a woman? You know, what's the general age? What are they doing? And you just pop it into a sort of code book like this, right? So just based, if you look here, so sex, age, occupation, it's just kind of mapping from this coding scheme, right? From the code book into the actual frame, to the actual data. So you just base it on those codes. So that's what we mean when we say coding. You're just giving everything that you can see in whatever your text is, a code, and that code will mean something. This is how we make meaning. This is how we go from millions and millions of words or loads of images or whatever into something that we can actually kind of make sense of. So you can see that that makes lots of sense, and it looks kind of, you know, it looks like we can kind of manage that, doesn't it? So yeah, you kind of directly do that. And yeah, reliability. So again, you know, it's really important to have a kind of solid coding scheme, kind of no overlap, no ambiguity, because, you know, it should be about being able to basically, you know, I have to do this myself. I have to tell other people to do my coding for me because I can't do it all myself anymore with the sort of studies that I do. So it should be very clear to another, you know, even though you're going to probably be doing, well, I hope you're going to be doing all the coding yourself in your dissertation. If you do this, you know, you will be doing it and you know what you mean, but the sort of, you know, key of content analysis and the kind of, you know, one of the sort of advantages of it and one of the kind of rules about it is that someone else could basically do that for you. You know, someone else would go off and do all your coding for you and it would be clear. And that's kind of what I would want to see. You know, if I'm marking a dissertation based on content analysis, I would want to see that, right? I'd want to see that it was clear, that, you know, you could hand that to somebody else and they'd probably have you know, after a bit of a chat, they'd have a decent idea of what to do. You know, it isn't confusing, you know, it's all nice and clear, you know. You know, we can sort of maybe make some critique of this, and we'd want to see the kind of field notes of this, how they decided the age, how they decided the occupation, all the rest of it. But you can see there, you know, it makes sense, right? It makes sense for probably the research questions that they applied, and, you know, it's sound at its heart and it makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say to you, and we do want to sort of see your coding scheme in the dissertation as like an appendix as well, because that's something that I would look through and say, like, you know, is this clear? Could I give that to kind of somebody and they'd be able to do it? Is there any overlap between categories? Is there like, you know, obviously there's subjectivity, but ambiguity is kind of something you want to avoid. And kind of if you do all that, then you will probably just get a high level of reliability anyway with your intercoder reliability. Because yeah, that's something that you should do as well. So you should kind of, if you're going to do this as a method, recruit a flatmate, a friend, boyfriend, mom, whatever, and kind of get them to actually code your data for you. I've recruited lots of people over the time. Boyfriend hates me. But get them to actually code a little bit of your data for you, and then kind of do this percentage analysis. So, a lot of the time I have 100% percentage analysis because they do the exact same codes that I did. But, it might be, 1 or 2 out, just, or even 10% out, 90% is high reliability, and that shows that you've come up with a good coding scheme. So again, that's kind of something that we would want to see in a content analysis dissertation, just a line saying 10% of the data was, or whatever was coded by a second coder who kind of, and there was 95% intercode reliability, something like that. You can do all these kind of fancy statistical tests on it, but you don't need to do that. I was just going to take you through a case study of one of my studies. Oh yeah, we've got time. So I just wanted to kind of do a worked study, right, of something that I just recently published. So, everyone knows that I kind of look at online campaigning, and I just kind of wanted to show you how I would do a content analysis. That's just mapping Krippendorf's questions onto this. But essentially what I wanted to look at was, campaign change, so how websites kind of deploy information provision, mobilization interactivity, which is kind of obviously a new kind of thing that is a sort of new feature of online campaigning, but kind of pulling that through from offline campaigns, so we can kind of draw lots of inferences about campaign change and the role of online media in that. And I also wanted to look at kind of centralisation and how much kind of emphasis different parties put on kind of central organisation versus sort of local organisation versus sort of individual level kind of freedom to campaign how the actual candidate wants to campaign. So I kind of did a pilot, and I looked at all the different sort of types of websites that candidates deployed. So that might be something that you have to do. You might have to do a pilot because you might not have any idea of the types of things that are actually out there when you start. If you're kind of doing, looking at hashtags, what are the kind of things on these hashtags? If you're looking in groups, what are the kind of different Facebook groups that are out there? You might have to do a little mini pilot just to start to come up with your categories initially. So that's what I did. And I kind of found that there were like profiles on central party pages, and then there were local sites. There were bespoke sites that the candidate had obviously paid some of their own campaign money towards, which is kind of quite interesting. And then there were like all these sort of party templates that had clearly been sort of designed at central level, but were individual websites that the candidates had set up themselves. So you can see here how it's important to be clear about what you're actually doing. Like, what is the difference between a profile on a central party page and a centrally designed template at an individual level? That can get quite confusing, right? So it's really important to be clear in your methodology. Well, this is kind of the difference. So this is a party profile. This is on the Labour website, the Central Labour Party website, but it's the kind of little space for the candidate to have, and he didn't have any other website here. This was all that he was using. And then there were lots of these sort of local sites that were kind of like, I think this was Leicester Lib Dems, and there's 5 constituencies, I think, in Leicester, and each candidate had their own little space. And this was a template. I think this template is horrible. But it's a centrally designed website template, but it's an individual kind of website for the candidate. And then I thought this was quite interesting. Like, this is a bespoke website, and I don't know if you heard about Gavin Shucker. Just a few weeks ago, he left the Labour Party and now he's an independent. I kind of think it's quite interesting that he chose this design. Like, you wouldn't know, would you, that this was a Labour Party candidate just by looking at it. Obviously, we've got Vote Labour on the 7th of May. But you're kind of having to really look for that, and I kind of find it quite interesting. Maybe part of him was already out of the Labour Party at the last election anyway. And kind of contrast it to this one, so, you know, Lloyd Russell Moyle is kind of, he's a real lefty and all the rest of it, and, you know, he's chosen a very different design. You can see here, you know, he's got red all over it. You would know that was a Labour candidate kind of at first glance. So you can see we can get lots of sort of meaning, and we can get lots of kind of different sort of, we can say a lot of things about, you know, if we've done our reading and if we've kind of come up with research questions, we can get kind of lots of meaning from these things just by content analysing them. And then I wanted to look at site features as well. So beyond the design, which is kind of tells us enough really, but, you know, I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this. And I wanted to look, you know, information provision is just very sort of standard campaigning information. You know, it's different than mobilisation, where you're trying to kind of get people out, and it's different from interactivity, which is a very online kind of thing that I wanted to look whether, you know, candidates actually been adopting that sort of thing. And you can just get it from, you know, the site. So, yeah, news, information provision, contact information provision. Get involved was actually signing up to go out on campaign, so this is a mobilisation feature. There's sort of interactivity going on here with email updates and subscribing. So, you know, you can see something about bees. So you can sort of see that, you know, there's lots of different information that we can derive from sites, you know, quickly and for free, and, you know, this is why everyone loves content analysis. Yeah, and then I did social media as well, so I wanted to look, because I was interested in interactivity and kind of pulling this through to social media, I wanted to look at interactivity as well. So, you know, we can see here that someone asked a question and no one responded to him, so this is really poor interactivity on Twitter as well. You know, it's the most interactive type of social media, well, that is commonly used in politics anyway. So this is kind of, you know, poor interactivity. And compare this, you know, to this interaction here. So we've got Vince Cable, you know, he's got his blue tick and everything, and he's kind of having a conversation with one of his presumably constituents. And, you know, we can't actually know whether this is Vince Cable himself, and it probably isn't, but if we kind of think of campaigning as the shop window, this is the sort of theory that we use, in some ways it doesn't really matter whether it was him or not. You know, it's the actual interaction that matters and the actual kind of information that that person got. So yeah, we can kind of code all this up, you know, and I was going to take you through, but you know, it doesn't really matter. Essentially, just the findings are that there wasn't much interactivity and there wasn't much mobilisation compared to information provision. So, you know, candidates are being very sort of conservative in their deployment of online campaigns. However, there was quite a lot of interactivity on Twitter, so, you know, sort of social media is kind of opening this up a little bit. That's the kind of conclusion. This is a bit more complicated, but you can read these papers are actually on the reading list for this week, so if you kind of want to look at these more in-depth papers as well, yes, do so. Right, so we've got, yeah, I've kind of wrapped that up a bit earlier, but I thought we'd have a little bit of a break because this task tends to go on a little bit longer than usual. And then we can do the content analysis task. So I've got some emails, real emails from a study that I ran in 2015. And I just thought it would be good to come up with some categories, how they can answer some sort of research questions, how we can actually, you know, just to get you going on the process of how you sort of read through a text, how you employ categories, how you sort of come up with categories, these kind of things. But yes, we'll have a little break first of all.